Rick was flying into O'Hare, where his parents would be meeting him. It was a commercial flight, but there were several derossing vets on board. He decided to wear his uniform like a couple of the others. When Rick's plane was just about to touch down in Chicago, the captain came on the plane's PA system. Welcome home to our brave soldiers from Vietnam. We'd like to ensure your well-being and have been asked to remind you that to avoid incident over your status as Vietnam veterans, you are advised to remove your uniforms before you deplane or soon thereafter. In the meantime, the temperature in Chicago is a chilly 28 degrees, with winds at 24 miles per hour. We're expecting to touch down in a few minutes early. It's been a pleasure being your pilot. The soldiers all looked at one another. Rick didn't even have an extra set of clothes with him. So he was so worried about Cracker that he hadn't even thought about politics. He saw one guy grab his bag from the overhead compartment and take it into the laboratory, emerging a few minutes later in his civvies. Civvies is their short for civilian clothes, which means non-military clothes. I'm going to stop right there for just a minute and do a little explaining before I read on chapter 29. Remember, we talked about there being a division in the country over whether we should be involved in the Vietnam War or not. Remember, Rick volunteered to go and fight in the war, but also Ms. Thomas showed you a video of the draft, also known as conscription. So you need to remember that a large majority of the men who were involved in the Vietnam War were drafted. They didn't have a choice. They had to go to the war. And as a matter of pride, they weren't going to try to get out of it because you served your country. When your country called, you went. But over the course of time that America had been involved in the war, it was very much akin to what you see nowadays. I was too small to really remember, but having studied it in school, again, I was probably getting the word is skewed, but getting a certain view of what it was like. But the country was very divided. And I'm not sure, like nowadays, how the news is very divided. You'll either have news that is either liberal or conservative. They either support Democrats or they support Republicans. The vast majority support the Democratic view. Now, what's interesting to me is that's what you call Democrat has completely changed from what it was just even when I was young. So let's say in the 1980s. So in 30 years, not even that long, maybe 20 years, the people that were Democrats, my father was a registered Democrat. And to him, the Democrats were the people who were for the poor worker, the farmers. They were more down to earth, real people. The Republicans were more the educated, wealthier, upper class. And everybody was conservative. There was no total liberal agenda versus total conservative agenda. It was a different divide. But the similarity was there were people who really, really were for the war, were really for people being involved in, or America being involved in the Vietnam War, or people who really were against it. So the tragic thing that happened was that a lot of the anger that people felt coming from whatever it came from, whether it came from the news media, like they're doing now, they whip things up. They like to whip things up and get people all upset, and we don't even know what to believe or what not to believe anymore. But the anger of the people who were upset about the war, instead of them being upset at the people they should be upset at, they began to direct that anger toward the soldiers. So the soldiers who had actually had no choice, who had been the ones fighting, suffering, and just some little bit of what Rick went through, were the anger of the citizens were directed at these soldiers. So when the soldiers had the uniforms on, people would mistreat them, spit on them, throw things at them, cuss at them, try to fight with them. It would remind you a lot of, you hear in the news about people who would wear Make America Great Again hat. You heard about that a lot. People would be out in public with some sort of paraphernalia on like that, like any kind of Trump paraphernalia or Make America Great Again. People would hate express their hatred for Trump and aim it at those people and throw their drink on them or rip their hat off their head, or if it was an anti-abortion people versus pro-life versus pro-abortion. If you had a pro-life sign and people were for abortion, instead of them just looking at your sign and saying, well, you should be allowed to have your own personal opinions, the people would feel it was okay to go and grab your signs and rip your signs up, that kind of thing. Well, that happened during the Vietnam War as well. And again, my feel for it is somewhat different because I wasn't in the middle of it. I was too little. I didn't understand what was going on. So everything I know about it, I only learned in school. I was alive during a little tiny bit of it, but I was too little. I was like 2, I think, when we pulled out of the war. So anyway, it would be interesting to talk to someone who was alive and watching the news at that time, and maybe some of your grandparents, and get their opinion on what that was like. So let's go ahead and read and see what happened to these guys. So some of them had their civvies on, or civilian clothes, and some of them didn't. Rick hadn't even thought of civvies. Cracker was all that mattered, he thought. This is what time does. It changes what matters. He smiled ruefully at himself. Rick the philosopher. There's our word, guys. Rick knew that some things would stick through time. This cracker thing wouldn't go away ever. As the plane closed in on land, the sun hung in some strange spot, creating the illusion that the streets below were like mirrors or something. Must have had something to do with the sun reflecting off the tops of the cars, Rick figured. As the plane lowered, he saw its shadow on one side of the ground, first small and then getting larger. It seemed like the ghost of Cracker running alongside the plane, but finally merging with the plane. By the time they landed, it looked like what it was, just a simple shadow. Rick saw neatly cut grass edging the runway. Weird. After all that elephant grass in Nam. The ache, it had gotten worse every mile he traveled farther away from Vietnam. When your heart belongs somewhere different from where your body was, it made everything depressing. Rick the philosopher again. As he deplaned in Chicago, he held his head high. Walking away from the plane, he limped a bit. What he pictured as a tough guy's limp. He tried to close off his inner ear like a dog could, but sometimes something broke through, like a couple walking together but clearly arguing, the woman stomping 2 feet in front, occasionally turning to the man and hissing something at him, the guy keeping his face back. Rick could relate to that. He kept his face blank now. A nice thing broke through, too. Almost made him smile, a happy kid saying, Mom, what's the opposite of nobody being there? Mom answering, one person being there? No, another of her kids said. The opposite would be nobody being there. Mom, the opposite would be nobody being there? Then he spotted his parents and grandparents waiting for him at the gate. His feeling of joy was accompanied by a feeling of isolation. He knew they wouldn't understand him anymore. He felt as if he would be divided between those who had been to Nam and those who hadn't. Rick! Rick rushed over. Mom, Dad, hey, Grandpa, Grandma. Everybody hugged him. I brought you extra clothes, said his mother. I thought you might not have any. The soldiers who weren't being met by anyone looked around tentatively. Baby killer, a woman called out. Somebody was talking to Rick. Several people glared his way. You talking to me? He snapped back. Let's get you changed, his father said. It's not worth fighting over. You'd have to fight half the country. Rick changed in the bathroom. When he emerged, nobody glared at him anymore. A part of him wanted to put his uniform back on. He wasn't scared to fight half the country. But instead, he quietly followed his dad. Okay, do you remember the girl who he said was about 7 years old, who stood up in the rice paddy and scratched the back of her head, and that was the signal for the ambush? Remember me telling you that it was guerrilla warfare, that they used women and children, the Viet Cong used women and children to fight the soldiers, the American soldiers. The American soldiers were constantly dealing with these booby traps and the fear that they never know when they were going to walk into another booby trap. You never knew when a little kid was walking up to you begging for candy or when they were going to throw a grenade at you. Okay? Well, sometimes these soldiers accidentally would shoot a kid or a woman. Remember, Cody had to kill a woman because she was aiming a machine gun at him and she was going to kill him. Well, the propagandists, the news people would tell the story of the soldier killing a woman or killing a child, but they would leave out the part where the woman was holding a machine gun or the little kid had a grenade in its hand. They wouldn't tell the whole story. So they made these soldiers look bad. So then this was what was happening. The American people were being manipulated in some way. And I'm not saying there weren't soldiers who did bad things. People are bad and good. I'm not defending them totally, but I'm saying that a lot of the things that were being said about the American soldiers were untrue. It was propagandized, just in the same way Hitler was, bringing propaganda against the Jews. So that's why we have to be careful. All right. When they got in the car, he immediately asked, "So, do you know if they heard anything about my dog?" His father looked straight into his eyes. "Sorry, son," was all he said. And Rick could tell he really was. And then he was home. Pancakes, lace on windows. He tried to feel happy to be there, but the thing that had been in his chest was in his stomach now. What used to seem like the real world now seemed like a fake. What used to seem like the real world now seemed like a fake. He wrote more letters, but without the same fervor. That means energy. He even wrote one to the principal at his old high school. You never knew who might help. He heard nothing for a few weeks. Many nights he sat alone on a lawn chair out back, staring at the street lamps rising from the next street. His parents kept reminding him that he needed to start training to take over the store someday. The family home had a great backyard, trees everywhere. As a kid, he'd loved the sound of the branches tapping the windows, but lately he would lie lonely in bed listening to the branches hit his window during an occasional breeze and feeling annoyed by the sound. So his math teacher had been all wrong all along. This is what applying yourself all came down to: silence, then wind, and the tapping of branches. Even he had to smile at that. Pretty poetic, if he did say so himself. One night at dinner, his dad said, "So, what about a job? You going to spend the rest of your life writing letters about a dead dog?" Rick could have answered a lot of things, but he didn't answer at all. Then he said, "I talked to my buddy John about a job in his security firm." He paused. "I'm going to get my own place." His mother looked aghast. That means shocked. But he knew he couldn't stay here. He'd been to Vietnam. He didn't belong in a house with lace curtains. Over the past few weeks, Rick had imagined he'd heard the phone ring so many times that it took him a moment to realize that it was really ringing now. At first, nobody moved, and then Rick pushed up off his chair and ran to the kitchen phone. "Hello?"